It's somewhat anecdotal, but most of the writing advice out there is anti-prologues. They say you should avoid them if possible because every story should begin at its most interesting part, so just start at the beginning. However, conversely, if you look at our 5 exemplars of world building, all 5 of them start with a prologue, sometimes multiple versions of prologues based upon how they've been adapted. And that's kind of weird. How do you square these two? How do you reconcile it? Well, Prologues, like an infodump, is just a tool, and today we're going to look at what they are, what they can do, their strengths and weaknesses, and which times to use it. Hi, I'm Matt, and I try to break down world building techniques, tricks, and tips, but today we're going to be more writerly focused as we look at prologues and how we can evaluate them using what we call the promise payoff gap. So let's start at the beginning, which is the definition, which is also ironic since we're discussing prologues, and maybe that intro was a prologue, but at any rate, a prologue. A prologue is pertinent information that is delivered to the audience before the story kicks into gear. It is always separated from the real through line, the main through line, by either time, distance, or POV. That's in the character that is experiencing it. Prologues have been around for forever, but at least ancient Greece, where they had the chorus and the anti-chorus, and it kind of makes sense that they did because these were plays, and these were men wearing big masks, and you needed to get information across, and you had a stage, and there were settings and stuff, but they really needed to orient the audience, so it made sense that someone would come out and say, this is what's going on. You need to know this ahead of time. And the prologue stuck with theater, and in fact, probably the most well-known prologue comes from Romeo and Juliet, where you have these 14 lines. Narrator comes out on stage, says, 2 houses, both alike in dignity, yada, yada, yada. 14 lines says, this is where we are, Verona. We got 2 houses, they're at war with each other, and, and a little bit these 2 members of these 2 families are going to fall in love, and it's going to end poorly. And it's even going to take about 2 hours. Like, it is all spelled out in those 14 lines. And so, like I said, like in Infodump, prologues are a tool, and we use them. And when do we need to use them? Well, that depends on a lot of different things of what you need. So let's look at the 2 components that go into a prologue. The first is information, and the second is a promise, which is a nice way of saying, like, stick around and you'll get the good stuff. And we'll break that down in just a little bit, but let's look at the information side of it first. There's lots of information that comes in a lot of different forms. Let's go with forms. First is setting, or the milieu, and these are the toehold details that we've discussed before in world building. These are the things to orient the audience to where you are, what time period you're taking from, these sort of things. You need to know where you are. Pretty important. Romeo and Juliet, hey, we're in Verona. Hey, these 2 houses are at war. Social milieu, setting. The second thing that a lot of times gets across in a prologue is the genre and the tone. If you see some magic or someone gets brutally murdered, you know that I'm in fantasy or a mystery or horror, that kind of thing. You also know that the tone, when I come out and there's flying dragons that, drop pudding, well, it's going to be more kid-friendly than if it, dragons come down and raise the village entirely. Which also goes to the third thing, which is the inciting incident, i.e. what kicks the story into gear. Think Lord of the Rings with the Forging of the Ring, and the movie version of it, that kind of thing, of like, this is what's going to start the story. It's not going to really start for a while, but this is what's important. This is, the myth, the creation myth, or whatever it is, whatever God did, whatever, which is going to send Odysseus eventually on his journey, that kind of thing. And fourth, just any other kind of information, just anything the audience needs to know for the story to make sense in a little bit. The second aspect of a prologue is the promise. And this promise is, I coined it, I don't know if anyone else has, I probably should have Googled that, but just the kind of professionalism you can expect here. But the promise is that something cool is going to happen if you stick around. Things are going to make sense after this moment, and they're going to be cool, but you really need to stick around, and that's the promise. Okay, and as I was saying, these are all based on genre expectations, which is the idea of the genre that I'm here for, and are you going to show me the things that I want from that? E, and they're usually eponymous, the drama, is there going to be drama? Is horror, is there going to be a sense of dread? Romance, is there going to be romance in it? These are all the genre expectations. Thriller, is it thrilling? Fantasy, is there impossible things? Same with science fiction. These are genre expectations, the thing that we read the genres for. And the prologue is to give a hint of the genre expectations. That is the promise. I know the story is going to start off differently, but stick around and you will see these things that we're showing you right here. And that's one of the reasons not all genres need prologues. Romance, you don't need to say stick around, the romance will be there. You can just kind of start at the story of, people not having romance, and we will get there eventually. People know in the genre that they do or do not need it. Historical fiction don't really need to start with, you can just start at the beginning of the story, don't always need a prologue. It's just sort of based on genre, and since I usually look at fantasy worlds and such, the fantasy genre loves the prologue. And the promise makes sense, as I was saying, the whole idea of needing to stick around. And it's because of the 3-act structure, which is secretly, 4 acts. And then, again, it comes from theater background, and Shakespeare's plays were 5 acts. He used a lot of prologues. And that is that you need a setup. And that is because the beginning of a story and the 3-act structure, which is hopefully has a infographic up somewhere right now. The beginning is the setup phase, and this is the character's life before it is thrown out of whack entirely with the inciting incident, and then the story really kicks into gear when they decide to deal with whatever the problem from the inciting incident. That means setup, usually showing the character's day-to-day life. Now, if they're a cop, you can start off with them like in the middle of a bust, and it can be exciting, but again, fantasy usually starts, with the trope of the farm boy with the sword, Harry Potter, that kind of thing of like, oh, my life is boring. And then something comes up and happens and it's magical and I'm, taken into this, neat world. But before that, it's kind of humdrum establishing the everyday, which is boring. So that's one of the reasons that we lean so heavily on the prologue in fantasy, just to say like, hey, by the way, there is magic, just stick around and the magic will show up. It works with other genres as well, and so that's the promise of magic, mayhem, or murder. Same with detective stories, like you show a murder, that kind of thing, and then we'll start to explain it a little bit later. Promise, just stick around. And if this sounds kind of like a familiar concept, it's because it's very much like Infodump equity. You show something cool and then promise you'll explain it later, and that's when the Infodump happens. And Prologue has a lot to do with Infodump equity, so please look that up if you haven't already looked at it before. So another new concept is the promise payoff gap, and that is the length of time between you have your prologue, you make your promise, and then when it becomes relevant to the through line, to the main story itself. And I maintain that the bigger the promise, the bigger audience interest that you have. That means you have them hooked because something was really cool, so they will stick around and keep their interest invested longer for the payoff to finally happen. However, the greater the gap, inversely, the less interest. So the longer you go, the less chance you have for that information to really land when it finally does come into play in the through line. My wife, God bless her, cannot pay attention for the first 3 minutes of a movie or show or whatever until she kind of clicks into gear. And if you front load all the information in the prologue, she's not going to hear it. So that is a little different right there and one of the drawbacks of it. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. We'll also break down all of our exemplars in a little bit and look at their gaps in a little bit again, and that may be my promise to you, so please stick around for it. But first, we're going to look at the 4 different types of prologues and break them into 4 different categories. The first is the infodump, which is just raw information. We've covered that before. The second is a scene, which is a scene. Montage, a collection of scenes, and then we have the framing device. Let's get started with Infodump, which is the straight dope. This is speaking directly to the audience, telling them something, Romeo and Juliet style. Again, we've come out, hey, we're in Verona, 2 houses at war, star-crossed lovers, 2 hours. Boom, 14 lines, told you everything you need to know. We've even told you that it's going to be a tragedy, which is a little bit of the promise right there. And some of our other exemplars of this would be Airbender, when it says, Earth, Wind, Fire, da-da-da-da-da, Star Wars with the iconic screen crawl of saying like, hey, we're going to have this, everything's at war, the rebels, da-da-da-da-da-da. Airbender, I probably should have come to second because it is kind of dressed up. It does look like a montage because, the beginning is like them showing off their powers and then saying the avatar's missing, that kind of thing. It looks cool and makes it much more palatable, but if you were to close your eyes, you could still hear all the information. So to me, that is being told directly to the audience, even if it is dressed up a little bit. And so those are the two most obvious kinds of, in a book, just telling, Lord of the Rings style, like these are what hobbits are, or the screen crawl in Star Wars, someone stepping out to speak directly to the audience. But they can also come from other forms too, ancillary inclusions. These are things like maps, family trees, lexicons. If they come before the story themselves, then they are still trying to orient the audience, and they are trying to tell you things like, hey, this big map is important, you will need to look at it. Look at the scope of my story, which is kind of a promise in and of itself. A lexicon is like, hey, these things are going to sound weird to you, but these words are important to understand the main concept, a myth or something like that at the beginning. These are all things that orient you. And their strength is that they are efficient. Boom, these are the things you need to know. 14 lines, Verona, houses at war, star-crossed lovers, tragedy. Weakness, as I mentioned before, people like my wife who can't pay attention to those first 5 minutes. If you front load it, they may not get it at all. And then when the gap is finally closed, they say, was that important? I don't remember why. Second type of a prologue is the scene. And this is a short scene, though it can be a couple of scenes. It's just, something that happens that is pertinent to the story. It is something that encapsulates it, usually happens years ahead of it. And one of the strengths of it is that it's more visual than someone coming out and saying, hey, two families alike in dignity. You're not being told, you're shown. So show, not tell. Especially in movies and such, very well used because movies are a visual medium. And so they break into, I think, 3 different types. The first one is the sample, and this is used a lot in horror movies or the fantasy examples. But in horror, let's look at that one. The monster comes out and kills. Jaws, great example. Even though you don't see the shark, you get the hint that there's a shark. It doesn't happen, I don't even know when it happens in the story itself, but before the story, to a character that's not in the story any other time, but it is a sample of saying, this is what you can expect later on if you stick around. This is the promise. Good stuff will come. Monsters, again, horror movies, same thing, the kill, and then you go into the main characters and their normal life before they discover that the monster is out and that kind of thing. So yeah. That's it. Scene, the sample, mysteries, same thing, fantasy, show dragons, and then we can have a lot of time without dragons. A second type is the inciting incident, and this is whatever kicks off your story. It can happen years ago. This is not a great example, but like the Maltese Falcon being stolen, and then, now we're going to have to try to find it. It doesn't have to involve the characters themselves, but the event that will later come into the story and make sense of it. Third one is the hero core memory or canon event, and this doesn't actually exist in psychology and narrative psychology, but I am too lazy to find out the term for it. But it's the whole idea that there's this one moment that made you as the way you are. Calling it core memory after Inside Out, which is what coined the term. It wasn't before that. And the whole idea that there are these memories that make you who you are. Your personality is based around that. And we rely on that very heavily. Think of Batman and why we have to see his parents murdered, and pretty much every single time we see him come out, parents get murdered, even though more people probably know the story of his origins than know the story of the birth of Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad. It is just everywhere. But we need to, get back to that every time so that we know why Batman is the way that he is. Harley Quinn, the show, third season, had a really good episode about that, and it was really good and quite clever. So, but again, it's not just, they use it in Batman, but also Star-Lord. Think about that in Guardians of the Galaxy. He starts off that way. And Conan, if we think about that. And this is a good example of several of them combined. And actually, this might be more of a montage since it did last a couple of years, but bear with me the idea of, Conan's, in the movie version, his family is murdered as when he's a child and he's sold into slavery. And, you see that. And it combined it too, though, because it also showed the inciting incident of James Earl Jones being very beatific in it. But you see like the villain, so it's a sort of inciting incident. You see the sample of villain being evil, so you raise a question of how is he going to deal with this guy later. And, Very good example. Other scenes, Game of Thrones, the movie, and the Harry Potter movie, which is interesting because the book was more of the montage, which is our third type that we're going to look at. And this is a series of scenes that is offering information and that you need for it, but it can go for a long time. It doesn't even need to be in a time. It's just kind of spelling things out again, infodumpy style, but seeing it. It can have its own through line too. Inside Out is a good example of it, where she spells things out and you see the kid going through the memories and having all this time and forming the memories and seeing how they work and all the other characters coming into existence. Pixar is great with these. The best example of a montage opening is probably Up. And it had its own through line, couple meeting as children to her death, and, you know, did we need that for the story? Could we have just started at the beginning with saying, old man living in a house, you know, gentrified, promised to take his wife this place? We could have just said that. Did we need those 8 minutes? Yes, they were amazing and they enhanced the story. That very long prologue is exceptionally well done and should be studied. Another good example of the montage would be the movie version of Lord of the Rings, where we see the creation of the ring. Well, not the creation of the ring. Yeah, actually the creation of the ring, now I think about it. You know, spells everything out. There's how many the elves got, dwarves got, Sauron got the big ring, he lost it, yada, 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 yada. It gets lost. This is the inciting incident. This is what, when Frodo finds, is going to kick the story into gear. Harry Potter, the book, I would maintain is, even though they sneakily don't call it a prologue, it is definitely a prologue since it happens 10 years before the rest of the story. Different POVs, Harry is in it, but, you know, tangentially. But the book version of it is more of like bad uncle, kind of day in the life of, and then it takes away from him, and then McGonagall, and, you know, Dumbledore, and yeah. So anyways, it was a longer montage, probably the least effective of them in my opinion. One of the strengths, or possibly drawbacks, is that you get a longer gap in your promised payoff gap because you have spent so long in your montage, e.g. Up, that, you know, by the time he finally takes off, you're like, yeah, it's about time. So more investment in the prologue can give you more strength, but it can also bore people to tears if you're not actually being very interesting. All right, fourth type is the framing device, and this is something outside of the story looking down into the story. Great example would be Princess Bride, of someone that's telling a story and they are examining the story as it's unfolding, and that is one of the strengths of it because it allows commentary to the story itself, which allows for something like lampshading, which is an idea of that if there's a problem, point it out to the audience to show that you've looked at it. So, you know, like, why are they gonna, 28 days later, one of my favorite parts is when they get to the tunnel and he's like, you know why this is such a bad idea? Because this is such clearly a bad idea, except he cursed, but I'm not gonna be doing that in this one. But yeah, the characters acknowledge that this is a bad idea because the writers are using them to do that. That's lampshading. And that is part of the commentary. You can kind of get away with things if you point out that, this is not a bad idea, but this is what the characters did. And I, outside the story, say it was a bad idea. It also allows for comedy, e.g., you know, Princess Bride. It's kind of break down into 3 different types. The first one is the storyteller / anthology, the classic Batman comic / cartoon of Almost Got Him, where you have all of the villains sitting around telling stories about the times they almost got Batman. And, you know, so it's a story about Batman without being told from Batman's perspective. It's very interesting, anthology kind of thing. Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt, you know, an anthology, Princess Bride, grandfather coming in to tell grandson's story when he's sick. Second type is the first person POV, and that is, you know, the main character is narrating the events of their own life. Pretty common. I can't think of so many great ideas. Name of the Wind. Anyways, that one's another one where it's like, oh wait, I'm telling a story about my life, and you know, and it introduces the idea of the unreliable narrator because you are seeing things that might not be how they are spelling out the story. Best example of this, where it is used exceedingly well, is True Detective. We have not one but 2 unreliable narrators in a framing device that are looking through the events of their lives, which eventually comes back into the story itself. Has great, makes a lot of big promises about, oh, you want to know about that murder, and they're happening again. You know, so unreliable narrator can work really well, but it's got to pull it off as the tool. Third type is the record scratch, and it's just calling it that from that meme where, they're in the barrel and you're like, stop, and you hear the record scratch. And like, you're probably wondering how I got here. And these are interesting because like the other ones, they're first person, usually, telling the story of like, how did I get to this situation? And then they're usually showing a scene from much, much further in the story. And then they back up to the beginning of the story and say, well, let's get into it. And I'm, gonna narrate it. You have to pause the story to go back to that moment and explain how you got there. Fight Club, probably the best example of it, where the opening lines are, everyone asked me how I, know Tyler Durden, that kind of thing, which was, I went and looked it up, very similar to the book. It's a great scene, great opening. I can see why they kept it because it has so much promise. But it made a really long gap since, the payoff to it is in the finale, like the last 5 minutes of the finale, maybe. These record scratch types are the most meta, and the meta are the sharpest tools. They look like they're the easiest to use, but one mistake with a really sharp tool and you just cut off something really bad, or you cut yourself, or and I personally did not like the record scratch because when I came up reading scripts for many years, they were very in vogue, and it seemed like every fifth one I read, it was like, I was narrating it, that's a flashback, and then, okay. And you realize that there is no tension for the reader, for me, when they are done poorly, until you get to that moment, because they are safe, because they're going to survive, until that moment right there. And that's when things really get real. So to me, it loses attention for all of that. However, Fight Club did it, and that's in my top 5 movies, as is The Prestige. Both of those use record scratches. High Fidelity does as well, as does Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which actually starts with a core memory and then goes into a record scratch and then starts the story. And that's 4 movies in my top 10, so that 40% that are record scratches. And so again, that shows these are tools. When done well, exceptionally well, but these are all from writers and directors at the top of their game. Both the Deadpools use record scratch. Mitchell's vs. Machine, I just watched again, and like, oh yeah, that was really good. So anyway, something to think about. They're mostly meta, like Deadpool talking to the audience. Then we got to get back to this moment when I blow myself up, that's the second one. Anyways, so yeah, framing device, keep in mind, especially the record scratch. So let's look at our exemplars. I have 5 that I use for world building examples in all my books, and let's look at how, and all of them have prologues. So we have multiple prologues because some of them were adapted and use different prologues. First one is Star Wars, and that is your Infodump, bam, intergalactic war. And then there's no gap. The promise payoff, it happens immediately, as in it says, that war, and then you get, finish the screen call, and then little rebel ship, big Empire ship, iconic shot, as is the screen call itself. So yeah, Infodump, straight to no gap, payoff. Airbender, same thing. You have the Infodump of the, these are the 4 things. Avatar can use all 4, he's gone. But hey, we find him like immediately. They find gang, kick the story into gear. Lord of the Rings, the book, is another Infodump, and it's the first chapter. These are hobbits. These are hobbits. Da. And then the next one is the Hobbit. The next chapter is the Hobbit party. So it kind of, low gap, immediately payoff to it, and is not something I would recommend for books these days. It's kind of grandfathered in because it's the father of all epic fantasy, and if you judged it in its own social milieu when it came out, this was new, this was a promise. This is like, oh wow, someone has looked and thought about these creatures. I can't wait to see how they show up in the story. So yeah, again, not a great idea from modern stuff, which is why when they adapted it, they changed it to the montage of the Rings history. They showed the they showed the inciting incident of the whole story itself in this own little through line, and then boop, brought it back into gear because it is the inciting incident for Frodo. It kicks off his journey and the story itself. So again, a short gap when Frodo discovers the ring itself. Harry Potter the book, as I mentioned, was a montage when it started off, as in bad uncle, day in his life, some kind of supernaturally stuff, but you didn't really see it. I didn't reread the book again, but I don't think you actually see it because I think it says stuff like there was a cat there, he speaks to it, and now there's not a cat there. And so that was kind of the weakest of them because it had a low promise, not much magic to seeing, just some hints of stuff, which is probably why they adapted it to a scene in the movie versions of it, which is like condensed. Uncle was cut out entirely, I think, and it is much more visceral this time and with much more hints with Dumbledore, just Dumbledore, McGonagall, Hagrid comes in with the baby, they say, oh my, and hope he's gonna be okay, and then short gap. I mean, it's not even 5 minutes before the story goes in, and I think that is an improvement to it entirely. So last one is Game of Thrones, and like if you get the book, it's to me incredible. It starts off with you should probably go read it again real quick. But it starts off with its setting and toehold details. You get the clothing that they're wearing, the types of swords that he has versus the other guys, and and you get the feeling, and it gets the class versus upper class versus the lower class, and sets this like really bleak setting, and it's gritty, and boom, ice zombies, and it's amazing, and they kill everyone. And it shows the tone and the genre in both of those, fantasy, because we see stuff that's weird, that's magical. At the same time, it's got, it's grimdark horror kind of elements, grimdark, and that the only one who survives it is a coward. And so it is set the tone and, pacing for everything. Also, it's very well written. And then it's got a big promise in the ice zombies, which were objectively cool. But then there's also the short gap, because in the next chapter, it is closed when, good daddy Ned shows what a good daddy he is by taking Bran with him to his first beheading that dad does, and it's the survivor from the first story, the Night's Watch, who ran away. And it's great because it closes that gap right there. It also redelivers like the irony of the situation and the theme that the good guys don't always win. And at the same time, it still has the promise going of the other part of the ice zombies, which take a really long time for them to show up. But it's great because it's got dramatic irony, because the audience knows about this, the heroes don't for a very long time. And when the ice zombies do finally show up again, it is epic and it is awesome. And it was so well done that is why they pretty much maintained it verbatim in the adaptation. So unlike the others where they had to streamline it, make it a little better, tweak it, Game of Thrones stuck pretty much to the written word of it. And I have no notes. This is what you need to do to understand prologues, in my opinion. Look at how they were done very well. And so there you go. As I said, Prologue is a tool, and I hope that you have a little better understanding now, and you know when to use it and what the strengths and weaknesses are, and I hope it helps you to build some better stories to go with your worlds. The core memory coming from what is that movie?